Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Broadly speaking, we care about tax because, to put it tritely, no taxpayer is an island. Tax avoidance and evasion by UK taxpayers doesn't just hurt the UK exchequer, although that's a problem. It leaches vital revenue from the poorest countries around the world. Developing countries lose perhaps 3 times as much revenue to tax havens as they receive in overseas aid. If we're looking for a future free of aid dependency, particularly with problems with declining aid flows that we've seen in the last year, this is not the way to do it. And to put this into context, just one UK-listed company that ActionAid investigated, the beer giant SAB Miller, have in recent years used a kind of combination of strategies to shift a little over £100 million of profits out of higher tax jurisdictions around the world and into tax havens annually. That means that developing countries from just one company's activity lose about £20 million a year. Now, that's not much by HMRC standards, but in the developing world, it's enough to put an extra 250,000 children into school. So that broadly speaking, is why we as an organisation care about tax. To take the kind of headline question, should taxes be more taxing? I think one of the things that strikes us in our work over several years on tax and tax policy is that it seems like aggressively avoiding taxes is beginning to be more taxing. We're seeing a sea change in public attitudes towards tax avoidance in the UK. We're also seeing governments pursuing tax avoidance much more aggressively, perhaps not yet in the UK, and we'll come on to that, but particularly throughout the developing world, and particularly amongst the kind of big beasts of the BRICS economies who are beginning to really challenge the kind of dominant developed world paradigm about how international tax rules should work. We've seen particularly comments by the Indian finance minister about where international tax rules should be set, whether at the OECD or at the United Nations, where developing countries have a seat at the table. And we've seen governments around the world going after particularly corporate tax avoiders, multinational corporate tax avoiders, much more aggressively than we have done recently. We see that in India with Vodafone, and perhaps in reaction to that, we're also seeing investors beginning to be concerned about companies managing their tax affairs responsibly. As governments, particularly developing country governments, become more concerned about tax avoidance and begin to pursue it with more kind of autonomy, what that means is that corporate taxes become a major risk for investors, and particularly because corporate taxes are at the moment a kind of black box on many balance sheets. We have seen a kind of shift in investors beginning to be concerned about what we might begin to call tax responsibility by companies. And so against that kind of global tide of concern about international tax avoidance, from one quarter, it's very kind of puzzling and baffling that we've seen action going in completely the opposite direction, and that, unfortunately, is from the UK government. We've seen the UK government taking a series of actions in the last 6 to 12 months that has absolutely gone against this tide of opinion and action in the developing world. So we've seen the government pushing forward with a kind of backroom deal with Switzerland to gather withholding tax on UK tax avoiders with secret Swiss bank accounts. This is a deal that not only treats UK tax evaders more leniently than law-abiding taxpayers, but it will also, and more importantly for us, it will also massively undermine international progress that's being called for and led in part by developing countries, international progress against that kind of banking secrecy and against those kinds of practices which essentially continue to reward tax evaders. And finally, and this is particularly important for ActionAid, we've seen in the last budget, in the last finance bill, a massive new corporate tax loophole. And this is a slightly technical issue, which is about taxes on controlled foreign companies. What this means in layman terms is that the budget is essentially dismantling the major piece of legislation which acts as the UK's defence against companies exploiting tax havens. We're seeing a new corporate tax loophole which the Treasury estimates will allow companies to move a little under £1 billion of revenue out of the UK, and which our own estimates think will incentivise profit shifting out of developing countries to the tune of £4 billion a year. And that's a little under half the UK aid budget. So we're talking about seriously big numbers here that will hurt both developing countries' revenues and they'll hurt the UK exchequer. We're seeing a massive disparity between the direction of political travel here in the UK and the direction of political travel and political concern in the developing countries where we work. And I think now must be the time to turn the tide. One way to start would be with the current finance bill, a bill that is massively going to impact on developing countries' revenues. But it also means looking seriously at how the UK's tax regime as a whole has a massive impact on developing countries' revenues.
Now, in the European Union, the state spends a little over half of national income, and this has become now more or less the average and indeed the norm. And for current levels of spending to be funded without borrowing, without imposing more burdens on the next generation, the tax burden would have to rise by about a quarter in the UK, a little less in most other European Union countries. And I think we need to ask ourselves first whether it's possible to have a shared sense of morality when the state is actually spending so much. When it comes to spending money on health, education, and so on, these decisions are taken collectively. But I would suggest that even in this room, there will be entirely different views on the morality of spending money, say, on the war in Iraq, on state money, that is, the war in Iraq, abortion, the state funding of church schools, providing child benefits to the well-off, and so on. I fear that the battles that ActionAid and Richard are trying to fight are a bit like the war on drugs. They believe that a few more policemen and some changes in strategy will actually, in the end, lead to the war being won. And I'm not convinced. In nearly every country in the world, with a few exceptions, huge amounts of economic activity take place underneath the tax radar. This is not just big companies avoiding tax. It can be as small as a transaction between a childminder and a mother or father who's having their children looked after by the childminder. The shadow economy is over 10% in Britain, 15% in Sweden, 20% in Italy, and 25% in Greece. And those estimates are a bit old, actually. It's probably quite a lot more in Greece now. And this should be a matter of very deep concern. The shadow economy, aside from the lost revenue, leads to a breakdown in trust and undermines societal cohesion. But why does the black economy exist? Well, the economic evidence suggests that about 1/3 can be explained by the level of taxes. Another quarter can be explained by something described as tax morale, which is the idea that people in the country think that the tax system is reasonable and broadly fair and that they get something in return for it. And economists studying these issues have noticed a spiral of decline. Taxes increase, the black economy increases, tax morale declines because we all feel that our neighbour or big companies or whatever are on the fiddle, and so the black economy increases, and so on. Any system of tax that is taxing companies with several hundred product lines operating in dozens of countries is going to have its problems unless we have a consistent basis for taxation. And I think the problem with the ActionAid approach is that they don't recognise that problem. There are various different bases upon which we can levy tax, and it's not actually obvious that the basis should necessarily be the country in which a company is operating. I think quite strongly, actually, it should be the owners of companies that are taxed rather than the companies themselves. The particular problem that ActionAid identify is that breweries, to name the example that's just been raised, and other businesses in Africa and elsewhere are paying insufficient tax. I think they miss the point. I would like to suggest there is a much more urgent problem. The problem in underdeveloped countries is not that there is too little business taxation, it's that there is too little business. When poorly governed countries receive much of their tax revenues in rents from natural resources or licenses issued to companies, rather than from the people to whom they should be accountable, it leads to serious economic problems and governance problems within these countries. Tax avoidance and evasion is a huge problem. I think we have a very poorly designed corporate tax system. Richard and I would like to reform it in completely different ways, but I think there is a bigger point here. Lower taxes, more businesses, and businesses that are compliant with a tax system go hand in hand and create a virtuous circle. That's what the evidence suggests, and I think it's on that very serious issue on which we should focus.
We're told that every election is about the economy, stupid. And yet, given that, there's remarkably little informed debate about taxation in this country, and everything the government can ultimately do about the economy in some way comes down to tax. We hear time and again discussion of details of tax, from the granny tax, the pasty tax, the charity tax, and so much more. But actually, what we don't hear about is the critical issue, which is that tax is a central part of our political economy. It's not just a central part of it, actually, it is the heart of it, in my opinion. Tax is central to any debate on politics in this country. More than that, I think the history of social justice in this country is written in our tax legislation. So, as the franchise extended, so did our tax base. As society's attitude towards women changed, so did their tax status. As the role of the family has changed, so has the taxation of children. As our attitudes towards inequality have changed, so have our attitudes towards progressive taxation and our willingness to tax capital. On the same basis, the current state of our tax system reflects the current state of our economy. Most scholars agree that we now have, at least in the upper ranges, a regressive tax system in the UK. Capital and wealth is now largely untaxed in this country. Our major corporations hide their affairs from view in tax havens, showing contempt for their shareholders, the state that really hosts their activities, the tax authorities of those places, and civil society alike. Large companies, when they pay tax in this country, pay less of their income to HM Revenue and Customs than their smaller, domestically based competition now. This inequality, permitted and even encouraged by our current government, induces an inevitable decline in employment, investment, training, and manufacturing in this country. Too often, we've seen HMRC cutting a deal with what is called UK PLC, a term that in itself, more precisely than those who use it can ever imagine, shows the capture of the state by powerful corporations and those who lobby for them. Nowhere is this more evident than in the creation of taxation policy, which is now almost entirely dominated by representatives of large companies. The result is that we have in this country a tax gap. In the economy as a whole, we suffer tax evasion, in my estimate, of £70 billion a year. It is because at the peak of our pecking order in society are the tax lawyers, accountants, and most especially, of course, the bankers, who make it their job to set up and run the tax havens that Mike describes abusing developing countries, and to set up the tax abuse schemes that are used too commonly to undermine the democratic mandate of our governments to collect tax. Now, I stress, all this happens by choice. And my point is that we can make another choice. We could create an honest, open, and transparent marketplace in which people could compete on the basis of their ability to supply goods and services that customers need, and not on their ability to cheat the tax system, which is too often what is happening now. We could, through international tax cooperation, crack open the tax havens that threaten our democratic processes and that declare economic warfare on us. Proper tax management has the ability that nothing else has to transform the economic prospects of this country, Europe, the developing world, and everyone. I stressed, just and well-managed taxes are, I think, the mechanism, and maybe the only mechanism, that can now deliver the economic freedom in which we can all prosper. But that can only happen if we choose to make it so. Tax justice, committed as it is to transparency, to accountability, to international cooperation, to progressive taxation, the taxation of wealth, and all of it based upon a belief in courageous governments committed to intervening on behalf of their electorates to deliver prosperity for all, could instead deliver real, sustainable growth. But in that case, to go back to the title of this debate, tax is not taxing, tax is liberating.
Now, we'll always argue about two things. One is what the absolute level of tax should be. I get your point, Philip, absolutely, and there's a real difference here between those who think high taxes and high social services are a good thing, and those who think that they infringe freedom and are ultimately counterproductive. So we'll have that debate, and we'll also have a debate about whether or not we kind of like tax, whether we think it's a kind of nice thing that we should be proud of, or something which is kind of onerous and we should be suspicious of. Now, we'll never resolve that. But why is it that beneath that we can't get to more of a kind of consensus around the principles that we would like to see in a good tax system? So we want a system that's simple, we want a system where people pay what they ought to pay, we want a system where what is taxed is bad things, not good things. Why is it, therefore, that this debate is so polarised beyond those things which we can maybe surely agree to disagree about?
We often see in the political debate a conflation between two things that you don't see when you speak with communities. In the political debate, we tend to conflate what the levels of taxation should be, and then that tends to get wrapped up in the issue of tax avoidance. In other words, the issue of whether people are not paying up to the rate that political process has established. Now, we can have an absolutely legitimate political debate about what levels of taxation should be, and that's part, a fundamental part of the democratic process. But what tends to exercise taxpayers and communities where we work, when we talk to them, is not so much the headline rates of tax, it's people not playing by the rules. It's this people paying what they ought, regardless of where government decides what ought means. So I think one of the things that would help a consensus if we separate out the legitimate political debate about what the level of taxation should be with the debate about going after tax avoiders, which is I think a separate thing, and that's what really gets people kind of exercised.
So just picking up on that point, Philip, because you made your points eloquently, but this is a challenge to you, and I kind of say this in my new Labour background of triangulation. Why doesn't the IA adopt a position which is to say we are fervently against high taxes, but we are actually more outspoken in saying that this middle grey area of creative avoidance is bad for the economy? We are actually going to be more outspoken than anybody else in saying let's crack down on this, let's stop this, expose the companies that are doing it, because actually that provides the credibility for us to make the case for lower taxation overall.
No, there's a dearth of academic work, except perhaps in this issue of taxing environmental bads, as you might call them, and so on, in the last generation, about what you might call public finance. When people talk about the public finance text that you might give to an undergraduate student, they refer back to the one that was written by Mervyn King when he was at the LSE decades ago. There just isn't, for some reason, there isn't either in academia nor in political discourse much discussion of the principles of taxation nor the principles of public finance. But I think there's another issue as well. When the tax system tries to extract too much from the economy, of course large companies will pay a fortune, and this is partly what this primary and public choice that you just mentioned is all about. Will pay a fortune in order to try to reduce their tax burden. People will go to great lengths to even do illegal things to reduce their tax bill. People will go to great lengths to spend money on complex avoidance issues as well. Not only that, you get perfectly legitimate demands for exceptions from high marginal rates of tax. So, for example, something you probably sympathise with, of families where both parents want to go out to work will often campaign, I suspect the IPPR do some work on this, to get some kind of tax relief or credit or something if they have paid help with their children, because taxes are so high. When you get an anomaly that somebody actually wants to employ somebody to enable them to go out to work, you need to make an exception to those very high tax rates, otherwise you get other forms of inefficiency in the system. And then we end up with a more and more complex tax code which only lawyers and people like Richard can understand. So you have Richard on one side of the debate and tax lawyers trying to reduce companies' tax burdens on the other side, and an 11,500 word tax code, and we end up with a discussion about A, the minutiae, and B, the level of taxes, and then not much on the principle of public finance.
On the one side, there's a group of people saying, look, if everyone paid their tax fairly, then maybe we could reduce the burden of tax. But you have to do the fairness thing first and the burden thing second, versus the other side of the argument, Philip's side of the argument, which says, well, if you reduce the burden, then people might be more inclined to be fair. So all this is just an argument about who should go first.
Let me give you a very simple, straightforward example of a place which has a very low tax rate, Jersey. They have one of the most effective general anti-avoidance rules in tax systems in the world. Because however low their tax is, and locally their taxes are very low, it can be as low as 11%, they still have to have a general anti-avoidance rule because that is not low enough to stop local people cheating. The point is, there is no tax rate low enough to stop people cheating. So this argument about keeping the burden down is simply not true. There is no relationship on that basis. It's also, I mean, we suffer, I'm afraid, and partly because we haven't had this debate I referred to a problem. We have had some very, very simplistic arguments put forward about tax. For example, we want a simple tax system. We have just had a simplification in the tax system proposed. It is called the restriction on giving to charity by wealthy people. Have you noticed the furore? They don't like it. They, on the one hand, say, I want a simple tax system. On the other hand, say, I want my tax relief. Now, there is a very simple answer to their problem. It is give no higher rate tax relief at all. I will have cut out a vast raft of tax simplification, made people's tax returns simpler, and altogether made life better for a lot of people. But the moment you offer that, it doesn't happen. We have a complex tax system because we have a complex society with lots of choices available in it, and that's why we have to offer people that choice. If we didn't have a complex tax system, people would not have choice, and I think you'll be very upset indeed about the lack of choice that was made available to people in the tax environment. That's why we have it. The problem is not that. The problem is we have people who want to absent themselves from that question of what is the right tax rate, which is determined by something which you all have a right to participate in, and that's called the ballot box. And the reality is that we have tax havens set up by accountants, lawyers and bankers to undermine democracy very deliberately in a criminogenic way. And that's exactly, for example, what the UK-Swiss tax deal does.